All right, well, we'll get started here. How we doing after surviving the mentor sprint? We doing all right?
Did anybody not survive? I'm curious.
Well, those that are no longer here.
Yeah,
we only have a few survivors. Actually, we have a ton of survivors here. But I realize we're mentor heavy on the survivors. The entrepreneurs didn't last the feedback that they got.
You know, I don't blame them. I know personally the feedback that I shared was pretty harsh.
Nice.
But I blame them. You know, like
I heard Keenan was pretty harsh too.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, back there polishing turds.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll get started here. So thanks for joining us for our Zero to Traction podcast live. So it's our first time bringing it in person, and looking forward to having a Q&A for all of you out here. This is our third event today of the day 3 of Global Entrepreneurship Week. So for those of you that haven't joined us all week, we are joining an international celebration of the role entrepreneurship plays in building thriving communities. We're excited in this region. We've had over 30 events that will be taking place this week. And then at the Carlson Center, we partnered with over 20 of those events that are happening. And so we're really excited about supporting founders and connecting founders to resources and people that will help them start and grow their businesses. And this is our third event here today, and I'm looking forward to diving into our discussion here, and maybe kick it away with what the Zero to Traction podcast is, and we'll plant the seed that we do want this to be interactive. We'll have a dialogue back and forth, but we also just want to hear what questions you have, and if there's certain topics you want us to chat about, we can dive in and have some fun around it. So take it away.
Sounds good. Well, I think we'll start with our usual podcast intro.
There you go.
That way we have that for the final release. So with that, I will remember the script as best I can.
Real quick, before we do the official start, is how many of you are subscribers to the Zero to Traction podcast? Nice. We got like 50 people out here.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can entertain you sufficient to get that number up a little bit higher. But with that, welcome to the Zero to Traction podcast, a podcast about how first-time founders create companies that scale. I am one of your regular co-hosts, JDM, aka Josh David Miller, sitting here on stage with my other regular co-host, Cameron. Cameron, how are you this morning?
Doing good. Good to be back in studio together in person. It's the last time we were in our office when we did it. But looking forward to having a discussion here today and just bringing this to Global Entrepreneurship Week.
Yeah, so we're live here at the Carlson Center at your magnificent space, and I know the camera angle for those of you watching on YouTube doesn't really do it justice because you're really just seeing the two of us in a screen. But it's a pretty great space with a lot of cool entrepreneurship stuff happen. So thank you very much for opening the doors here for that. And I'm curious. I know that we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast before, but on the self-deprecating assumption that people don't listen to every episode. What can you give us like a quick primer on on Global Entrepreneurship Week, and like that's a week, like that's a lot.
It is.
So why?
Yeah, so the program is run by the Global Entrepreneurship Network, and they kicked this program off, I think, about 15 years ago, really with the role to celebrate the role entrepreneurship plays and really building thriving regions, and that entrepreneurs are the problem solvers of today and of the future. And so how do we wrap around those individuals and really elevating the role entrepreneurs play? And so, in Sacramento, before I joined the Carlson Center, Sac State was kind of a lead. They had, I think, probably about anywhere from 6 to 8 events that would take place during that week, but it was pretty insular just to Sacramento State. And then when we started looking at the Carlson Center and the role that we could play in kind of growing the Global Entrepreneurship Week, we kind of expanded some of those outward to bringing the community into the space. And so, and part of getting introduced to the program, they, create competitive nature as in entrepreneurship, and they had kind of leaderboards, and so a lot of it was trying to create more activities. But as I think about the role, was like, how do we foster discussions and connections to support entrepreneurs in succeeding? So like just before this, we had the mentor sprint, and all about building those relationships and connections to support those founders in succeeding.
Awesome. Well, cool. So like happy to be taking the pod here. As you mentioned before, we'll be taking questions, like then ask me anything or ask us anything, AUA, I guess. So, Cameron and I have no trouble filling the time with whatever we want to talk about. So we can actually do that. But if anybody here has some questions about the process of finding traction, what that looks like, maybe something specific to your company or anything like that, that's what we're here for. Little AMA for any questions.
Maybe just to get started, like,
yeah.
I'll ask, maybe share a little bit about what led to us kind of launching Zero to Traction, and like we've had our kickoff, and then we stopped and then got back into it. And so maybe share a little bit about, for those that don't know, how we got to where we are now.
Yeah, so we started the podcast last year. I think maybe summer of last year, something like that. No, it was early last year, like January of last year. And I think part of it was it was post-pandemic, and we're white guys, so we have to have a podcast. It's the law. And so we started down that path. But I think you and I see a lot. We talk to so many entrepreneurs. You talk to more than I do, but like we talk to entrepreneurs all the time, and we end up seeing like the same questions all the time. That there's certain every startup is different, and every startup has its own unique challenges. But that there are also a lot of challenges that people run into all the time in trying to find things. And so I think part of it was like, let's have this library of audio content, video too, because we do live stream to YouTube, but of content around topics that we can point people to. But then also, having the opportunity to just talk about the things that I feel like get a little bit lost in and this is our fault, right? But like in the programs that we run, in the programs that we serve, I think oftentimes we have this really glamorized view of entrepreneurship. And I think that part of that's necessary, because it's really so fucking hard that if we didn't glamorize it a little bit, nobody would do it. So I think there's a little bit of that that's necessary. But at the same time, I think we put this gilded layer on top of the entrepreneurship process. And there's a lot of just like really tactical, really important things that we kind of set to the side, all in favor of the pitch competition. And there's nothing wrong with those. Like, they have a place. I participate in them all the time. So those have a place, but it's not the be all end all. It's like the process of giving a good pitch is a process of distilling a story of a good company. So if you don't start with a good company, you're kind of lost. So that was kind of some of the impetus for me. And then I'd love to hear from you, but like the quick circle back here is we ended up taking some time off late last year. I think around the end of last year. I had a kid, and yada yada yada. We got busy, and so we decided to bring it back a few months ago. And so it's now a weekly podcast. We've done one every week except for the one that we had all those technical difficulties on. But
yeah, no, and I mean, for me, the similar thought process was when we were just having a lot of these conversations, I think, about the tools and frameworks that we work with entrepreneurs, but oftentimes those conversations don't always get out because there's not an event or a space in a forum. And so really trying to advance that conversation and kind of scale our discussions and fun times that we have together. So I thought that was kind of my real intention. And I think in launching this, I realized how even our, we've shifted from having a real structured way of doing it to like a much more dialogue that I think makes it more natural for us. So
yeah, and that was part of we went through a learning process as we were doing this, that when we had started the podcast last year, we would decide in advance what we wanted to talk about. We had an outline for the show, literally in a Google Doc that was a template, and we'd go through and we'd have different segments where Cameron would be the producer and I'd be the talent, and then we'd switch and I'd be the producer and he'd be the talent. We'd had this thing back and forth to create what we thought would be a good show. And I think it was fine, but it wasn't very fun. And it was stifling. Cameron and I have a really good interpersonal relationship, and that just kind of fell through by doing that. So when we brought it back, we were like, our condition, I think we had the same one, is we're not going to do that. We're just going to, get on it and talk. And so I hope I'm not spilling too much information here, but we record every week, and we hop on Zoom at the same time, other than today, where we're at a different even day of the week because we're at Global Entrepreneurship Week. But where we hop on and we spend the first 5 minutes talking about what do we want to talk about today. And usually one of us will have something that is on our mind, and we can easily fill 45 minutes with that. And then we have a nice dynamic conversation. So
we'd love to hear kind of what's on, for the entrepreneurs in the room, what's on top of mind for you as you're thinking about building your venture, and maybe some feedback that you heard during the mentor sprint or different elements as you're thinking about bringing your ventures, or even for our mentors that were in the space, like where did you see gaps in the entrepreneurs that you were engaging? And we'd love to hear what questions or topics come to mind for you. Yeah, Nathan.
So I know you guys have talked about innovation accounting before. So can you talk a little bit about if you've kind of gotten your team together and gotten some idea of what the direction you want to go in and so on, how do you go week to week or day to day, keeping track of whether or not you're making good progress? You're way before product market fit.
That's a great question. I'm going to repeat it so that the microphone picks it up here. But the question was, we talk a lot from Nathan, was we talk a lot about innovation accounting and how do you go about the process of actually doing that? You get a team together, know what direction you want to go. Like, what do you just literally do week over week in order to did I capture that right? Okay, cool. Do you want me to
Go for it.
Okay. So I like innovation accounting is a big thing for me. So I could fill up the rest of the day on that, but I will spare you. But the basic idea for those of you who aren't familiar with innovation accounting is the idea that in a really early stage startup, all the traditional financial metrics are functionally zero. When you first get started, they're literally zero. You have no sales. And then as you get further into the process, they're still functionally zero. So measuring like revenue and market share and all that just doesn't do you any good. Like, you know, if you're doing a SaaS thing and, you know, you're charging $10 a month or something like that, and let's say you have 10 customers, so $100 a month, and, you know, you get 2 customers churn, that's interesting. You should find out why. But does that necessitate a 20% drop in your revenue? Like, is that really the thing that matters? It's really not. It matters if it becomes a trend, right? If churn is a persistent problem, and churn is something you can measure. But just like that overall revenue number is not very useful. And so that's where we have this idea of innovation accounting, or as the old joke is, not innovative accounting, that lands you in prison, but innovation accounting. Innovation accounting, the idea is premised on like what does matter. And it's a chain of leading indicators leading to the big thing, because what you're measuring on the balance sheet tells you if you were successful yesterday. And what we're looking for is a signal that tells us, will we be successful tomorrow? And that's the shift. And so to do that, you start with that future thing, because we still need to get to revenue. We still need to get to market share, those are things. And then we reverse engineer this leading chain of indicators that, you know, in order for that to happen, this has to happen, then that has to happen, then that has to happen. And if all these things actually happen, we get there. But if that first one doesn't happen, then we're screwed. And so that first thing that needs to happen is the thing that we actually need to measure. So in some early stage companies, that's literally customer interviews. Right? Like, you just need to be getting out there and talking to customers. And then it's good. Then as you start talking to them, it's going to change from a number maybe of how many you're talking to are you getting consistency in the conversations? Are there trends in the qualitative analysis that you're doing that you can pull out of that? And so the basic idea is, okay, start by you know, picking the metric that matters, which will change over time, which is a signal that you're on the right track, and it's what matters today, not what might matter tomorrow. And they tell us today if we're doing a good job today, and if that's likely to do success tomorrow, not about reporting on yesterday. And then once you have that that metric, there's a few other things to keep in mind. So one is there's a really, really big trend in startups, I think probably everywhere, honestly, but I see it particularly in startups, of what are called vanity metrics. And so these are measuring the things that just don't matter at all, but they look good on paper. And so revenue can sometimes be a vanity metric, particularly in the early stages, where it's like not that the revenue number in and of itself isn't that helpful in determining whether you're on your way toward product market fit, particularly for SaaS. And so there's something else depending on your product that's probably more interesting, something more engagement focused or churn focused or something like that. But that can be a vanity metric, but there's also lots of other things that we end up measuring. Like the classic example is how many app downloads you got from Google Play or the iTunes store, or the Apple store.
The Zero to Traction podcast download. That's what we.
Well, that's different. That actually is our like it is a metric for us. But so don't go raining on my parade here. Watch those metrics, man. But like, yeah, picking a metric, it doesn't really matter that much. So you get that's something else you want to keep in mind. Again, I can talk about this all day, so I'm going to just kind of pause there to return back to this question. So assuming that you already have that metric identified, then there's a couple of things that are important. So one is that you're always making sure that in advance, you're asking questions that are going to get you that data, not looking for that data retroactively. So this is it's really common for somebody to say, like, I wonder if I can get people to click on an Instagram ad or swipe up on an Instagram ad if I throw one up. And so they say, I'm going to put this ad up and I'm going to see what happens. The problem with seeing what happens is that you'll always succeed in seeing what happens. But you won't learn anything because like you didn't set out a metric, like a benchmark of success. Instead, I'll let Cameron go into the details of like the test card and learn cards from that, but like you want to set that up in advance so that you know whether or not you're actually on the right track, like pretty objectively. You want to unambiguously be shown to be true or false when you set out to measure something. Well, that guides your team meetings. So like the first one's going to be, here's what's most important for us. This is what we really need to measure right now because this is what we need to learn from the market. And then, okay, let's do some experiment design around that. And then once you do that, then the next conversation is, well, here's the data, right? And then you can analyze it and then synthesize it and then pivot, persevere, or pack it up, whichever makes the most sense there. So at that point, I'm going to kind of pause. And I think experiment design is really important. So
yeah, no, I think just tying into that, I think that two things I would add. One is it's really a demonstration of like where you are in demonstrating value. So at the earlier stages, like when are you targeting the right person with the right value proposition, and is the metric that's demonstrating that might not be, some revenue down the line, because that might not actually be who your core customer is. It might just be a friend or family member that's trying to support you, right? And that's not the right thing to be measuring at that given time. And as we tie it to the three major risks, I think is really what we want to measure those around the desirability, viability, and then feasibility elements of your overall business model. And so when we think about the test cards, and those that have done our startup challenge, we're obviously very prescriptive on what that looks like, but it's really identifying what that clear hypothesis is. So is it that you're doing a customer validation test and you're doing customer interviews to start to validate those things? Is it that you're testing around the actual value that you're creating and you're going to be measuring a metric such as time saved or something that they're ultimately engaging in? And so when you're thinking of like what is that specific hypothesis and having that be specific and discrete, and there's one other element, falsifiable. So it's like, here's what we're aim of the test. Here's how we're going to test it. So what is the artifact or actual thing that you're going to create and put into the world to then see how people interact with it? Then what's the metric that you're going to be measuring? And then ultimately, what is that number that ultimately demonstrates that you're right or wrong? And I think that's that last part that people don't put a specific metric to it. And like part of it is like not just pulling that number out of thin air of like 50% of people, right? Is like you need to demonstrate if that's like actually going to lead to certain things in the future. So it's like if I put this Instagram ad and I say only 10% of people will click through, well, if you start to do the numbers of using a tool called the Customer Factory, if only 10% of people are clicking on it, you might need to get in front of 10 million people every day in order to get to the revenue metric that you want. And so it's really kind of basing some of that on your overall model as you think about it. And so there is kind of that art and science to it, but as we're looking at it, I think a part of it is like what the metric ties to what is the core assumption that you have around your overall business, and that ties to those three major risk areas of desirability, viability, and feasibility.
Yeah, I think one thing, just kind of underline it a little bit, is this idea of getting data back and then asking the important question. The important question to me is, what does this mean, right? And so, like, if you get a data, let's say you said it was 50%, and let's just assume that you made that up arbitrarily, which I don't recommend. I agree with Cameron, but like, let's just say you said, well, I think 50% of people are going to click on this ad, and you get it back, and the number's not 50%, it's 40%. Well, what does this mean? What does it mean for it to be 40%? And there's a whole spectrum of things it could mean. But to oversimplify, it could mean that, like, well, that sinks us, actually. We don't have sufficient margins. Like that, our customer acquisition cost is just going to go up too high. That's probably not true from 50 to 40, right? But if it was, you thought 50 and it was really 2, well, that's pretty significant, right? Are we sunk? Or do we need to, like, is this the wrong channel? Is it the wrong message, right? There's another hypothesis that comes from that, and only comes from asking, what does this mean? And so to set that up, I completely agree that, like, you have to come up with what success looks like, which is why, like, I've written about this a lot on my Substack. But the first rule for me of being a startup founder is maintaining a model. And so you have to know, and that could be a customer factory, particularly in the later stages, like that's fine. In the early stages, sometimes it's just, who's the customer, what's the value proposition, how's that value created and delivered, and why does this make money? But like, when you just set that up as, this is what we think the company is, right? And then you can base your number based on that model. And it doesn't need to be a sophisticated, like multi-tabbed spreadsheet or something like that, where you have like a sophisticated model, some Nate Silver bullshit. Like, we don't need any of that, right? Well, I mean, maybe in the later stages, but like in the early stages, you really don't. All you really want to see is like if I can find people on Instagram where I think that they are, what % do I think I need to hit in order for everything to pencil out downstream? Because if you remember, like, that click is just acquisition. Then you still have to get them to sign up or activate, and you have to then get them to engage with the product, hopefully pay, and hopefully stay with you, maybe engage in some referral down the line. So it's like, you need to be profitable through the end of that, and those percentages stack on each other. So like, just as an example, let's say everything was 50%. It's not, it's less always. But like, let's say it was 50% across the board. Then you're doing like, 50% click on the ad, and then 50% sign up, and then 50%, let's just say pay, and let's just stop our measurement there. So 50 to 25 to 12 and a half, which means that if you like do the math that way, that's 8 times like the 1 in 8 customers that you actually expose to on your ad are ever actually seeing it. And so we think about your customer acquisition cost. If your cost per impression is $1, it's costing you now $8 per click, $8 per customer, which maybe isn't so bad. But again, these numbers are 50% and they're not. Like, on an ad, you're going to get 2%. So start doing the math there. And so that's where it becomes important to base it on something that makes sense, that's like a model. And even though you are making up the numbers, like the numbers, you can use best practices, and like, you can ask the AI and it'll give you some like good directionally accurate stuff to just kind of base something on. But you can base it on something, put it into your model, say, here's what it looks like. Oh man, I can't make a business out of this, right? Or, oh man, I can, this is awesome, this is cool. Then you go out and measure based on that number, data comes back, and now you're getting what's called validated learning, and you can revise your model appropriately. And then you just keep going through that process. And that's all a startup is. Right? A startup is an organization in search of a business model. So all you're doing all the time is that. Here's the model. Here's my riskiest assumption out of that model. I'm going to test it, and then I'm just going to keep doing it until my whole model now doesn't need that anymore. And then we just scale.
And the last thing, and we'll take another question, was I think when often one of the flaws I see in pitching is people do position those vanity metrics, and then they're just going to like look right through that and say, oh, you shared how many number of downloads you had. It was like, well, what's the user engagement, or what's the daily active user rate? And then that kind of opens up the flaw that maybe you're not getting the engagement, and that's a signal of like maybe there isn't actually that value that's being ultimately positioned or seen on whatever that you created. So.
Yeah, and oftentimes the metrics that you're looking at, just to because I don't think we actually said this, oftentimes they're not even obvious. So like we've only used obvious things here, like click rates and acquisition rates and all that stuff. But sometimes, like, we had one startup that we were working with a couple of months ago where the metric was devices on dudes. Like, it was a device and software play. It was a razors and blades model. And so like the actual early revenue it's not very interesting, but the more devices that he can get on the people who need to wear these devices, then for reasons that don't matter here, the more likely he was going to be positioned for success in monetization in the future. And so the right metric for him was, am I getting devices on dudes? Sorry. Did we sort of answer your question, Nathan? Okay.
I've been in the Carlson Center ecosystem for a while, so I know all the David Bland, Mom Tests, all that good stuff. So I'm kind of curious. One of my favorite business podcasts, they talk a lot about interesting business ideas that they see throughout their day to day. So I'm curious. Both of you see a lot of businesses on a weekly basis. Any ideas that stood out to you, or opportunities that stood out to you that you think are interesting?
I have a controversial take, so I'm gonna let you go first.
I like to start with controversial.
No, I never see interesting ideas. And that's because ideas to me are worthless. Absolutely worthless. I don't give a fuck about anybody's idea. Here's a tip. Here's a pro tip. If you're coming up to somebody like me, which I guess I should define what that is. That's not somebody who's cool despite the orange shoes, or somebody who knows what they're talking about, which that just depends on the day. But just somebody who's in the ecosystem that you might want to connect with, or who runs programs or can help you with that kind of thing, or just provide advice and mentorship along the way. And if you want to approach them and go up to them, I don't recommend saying, here's what my idea is. It's not interesting. And we hear all the time, I have this great idea for X. And I've heard between 3,000 and 4,000 startup pitches. And that's not random ideas at events, that's pitches. I've heard all the ideas before. I don't care. Like, I just don't care. And what I do care about though is what have you done with it, right? Because you'll never hear anything truer in entrepreneurship than this, and that is that, you know, investors, programs, and the like will all day long put money and time into an A team with a B idea, but they'll never put their time and resources into a B team with an A idea, because it's your ability to do something with that. So I hear all the time about founders working on something cool and they have some cool progress that they can show from that. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like, you fucking rock. Like, we need to talk. I meet those people all the time. We're a great ecosystem. We got awesome people here. But the ideas in and of themselves are, I think my own ideas are awesome. Like, I'm a normal person. I come up with ideas. I'm going, that's the shit right there. That's going to sell. But as far as like hearing other people's ideas, it's pretty rare for me to hear something that I'm like, oh, that's cool and interesting. And it's, again, because that's just the volume of ideas I hear. It's like, you know, yeah. So there's my controversial take.
Well, I'm glad I went second, because I probably would have stepped in it. These are the ideas that I like. No,
you can do that. Like,
no. I
my
think
opinion.
like what the ideas, or I guess the ventures that I see most interesting are the ones that are like less sexy problems. They're not like, it's not AI first thing. It's like, oh, there's like this actual issue that I might have experienced. So like one that comes to mind is 811 spotter, which is like call before you dig. And it's not like a glamorous thing, but it's like a real problem that like contractors have. And so it's like some of those things that like they've identified a core problem and they can really articulate it, and that they're actively getting in front of those people. And so it's less of the idea, it's the accumulation of action that they've taken. I think to one of Josh's points, in relation to like what's exciting is like the progress, but like people actually going and doing something. And what I find often is like people want me to go do the work, or like, hey, here's a you know, I just need someone to help me find, or I need you to help me do this thing. I was like, that I'm not just going to go do the thing for you. If I did, I would just build the business and trying to do that. And so I think it's taking some of those steps and saying, hey, this is where I've tried something, this didn't work. You know, do you have ideas or connections to support in that? Versus I have this idea, you know, what should I do with it? You know, a lot of it would just go back to like, you know, have you talked to your customer? I was even, you know, chatting with someone during the mentor sprint, and they, you know, yeah, there's a cool idea in it. I think it was like a truck or something of that sort, and was like, have you gone and talked to truckers? And they hadn't gone and talked to the target audience, right? And so it's like getting out there and doing some of that work. And so the idea is interesting, but going in and actually talking and getting that feedback.
See, you actually should have gone first. Because I actually really like how you answered that question. Like, I could have answered it that way and I didn't think of it at all. Instead I was just a dick to Ethan. But
It's not the first time.
No, not the first time. Ethan knows me. I'll give you some personal patterns for me. Since that's kind of what you had there. So I tend to like B2B. I don't like B2C so much. There are exceptions up the wazoo, but like, to me, B2B, it like, people tend to think of it as less sexy, right? Because it's not the app on everybody's phone, but it tends to be more profitable and they have a higher success rate. So I like B2B. I don't like platforms. I think platforms are overrated. I think most of them fail. I think they're extremely difficult to get off the ground. There are exceptions to that. They happen all the time, but just by and large, I don't like platforms. It has to be really compelling. And so some of the ideas that I like are ones that are like B2B, not a platform, usually some SaaS adjacent thing. And for me, they have, I get excited when they're like, oh, I went and talked to the truckers and I found out, you know, these 3 things. And this is like a really big problem that nobody's really paying attention to except for the people who have the problem. Because I am instantly interested in that, because I'm the entrepreneur type. I get excited by opportunity, less about the cool, like the quote unquote cool idea. The cool idea is the opportunity, right? And so if you like, you know, if it's in my own personal biases, you know, B2C and platforms and stuff aside, like if you just come at me with something like that and you say like, you know, here's a little validation, like this is a really big problem and I think you do it, then you've already impressed me. So yeah, that a little bit less dickish.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I should have rephrased, like, you know, if you see like cool people doing interesting things or getting interesting traction, like not necessarily an idea, but just like, you know, people doing cool things. I've been listening to the podcast lately. I like the Liz Connolly with Trifecta episode. That was really great. I know you've been doing a lot more interviews with entrepreneurs lately, but maybe if you guys like do more interviews together, you could have like someone cool doing a cool thing segment or whatever, where you're like, oh, I saw a team like putting crackers on cats today. Like, that's cool. And they made some progress.
Yeah,
Are you doing that?
No, but I have the issue. If anyone has like neighborhood feral cat solutions, let me know. We got like we have a ring camera in our garage. We see like 40 different ones go in and out every day.
There you go.
Trap, neuter, and release.
I try, but if you have a full
TNR.
you can't track pets.
Laura's done it. Like she does that in her home. 12 cats. Yeah. So I think I appreciate the suggestion. I think that's great. Last year we had, not every time, but our language, our vestigial trait of this was we refer to ourselves both as co-hosts as opposed to like host and co-host or anything like that. And that was because we were bringing in a rotating panel of additional co-hosts, and they would just be people who were working on something kind of cool, and they would just literally co-host the episode with us. And so we've been toying with the idea of bringing that back. So I really appreciate the suggestion. The other one, for those of you who don't know, shameless plug time, that interview with Liz Conley, I apologize, Cameron. I have another podcast.
Cheating.
I am, like, shameless.
One, he's actually paid to do it.
Well, yeah.
That's not this one.
So the Startup Sack runs a podcast called the Startup Sack Podcast. That's weird. And that they got funded through an innovation grant from the city of Sacramento. And that's all interviews. So it's just me interviewing founders right here in Sacramento who've gone that, who are somewhere on that journey from idea to IPO. And we've had IPOs on the show, a couple of people at that stage. We've had companies that have raised, $40, $50 million, and we've had seed stage companies on there as well. And so a lot of fun stuff there. So very different format than this show. But thank you for listening.
Sorry, I accidentally completed the two because you're on.
I don't blame you. That's But anyway,
What else is out there?
what else we got? Yeah.
So here's my idea.
Is it a good one?
Just kidding.
Tell us more.
I like your style.
No, but so going like, because I'm probably more on the zero than the traction side as far as like the question, but to be a resource to potential entrepreneurs, people are like interested in it, but they're really starting with like no knowledge on how to start that process and be able to guide them in the right direction. Obviously, like there's a ton of great resources in the region to point people towards, but just kind of expanding, like you said, you need to be able to figure out like your target market. Is there actually a market for this thing? Do people want it? Is it viable, feasible, all those things? But what are some other things that people can do so that when they do meet somebody like you, they're prepared to really, like they've done all of the steps leading up to that, to where it's like, okay, now we can actually have a conversation about moving forward.
I don't think I'm particularly special, so I use people like me as an example for my own personal opinion. So I just want to make that clear. But like when it comes to programs and everything in the ecosystem, the two best people in Sacramento to talk to about that are right here. One of them is my co-host Cameron, and then Laura Good. So I'll assume that you'll connect with them and find out all the things. I have an answer. But
I have a
I'd love
less
you to go first.
specific in being prepared. I think one of the things that I would recommend someone at like the zero stage, like I want you to hit on like customer discovery and doing that work, I think is like coming and engaging in the ecosystem, because it's really about the connections that are going to help you get to where you want to go, whether that's, hey, I need to do customer interviews. Like, do you have access to people that I can ultimately get in front of? Or you hear another entrepreneur talk about their process and where they failed versus trying to do that on their own, like do all that pre-work by themselves. And then like, hey, I'm ready to finally talk to you, when they could have just been in that space and now have a different relationship with you, and ultimately engaging in the ecosystem that way. So I think that's the biggest thing, is like, showing up to the startup happy hours or 1 million cups or other resources that are just a regular staple. And then you're going to meet the people that are even outside of this room, obviously, that will help them in that process. So that's the like less tactical way, is like, don't build in isolation and then like think, okay, I'm going to hit this point where I feel like I'm ready, versus just being like, immerse yourself in it, and then it'll be more organic in that process.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people start engaging with the ecosystem when they need something from it. And by then, like the best time to look for a co-founder is not when you need one, right? It's before you need one, because it's a relationship that needs to be developed over a long period of time. And that applies to everything.
I mean, even Josh and I the first time I met Josh, I didn't like him. So
not hard to imagine, honestly. And we both met, by the way, while we were volunteering for one of these programs, and along with Laura. So like, yeah, show up and just like do the work. You're gonna get respect that way. So yeah, a specific answer that I'll give you. I'm sorry, what was your name?
John.
John, okay. Specific answers to like what are the kinds of things that aren't just like, oh, go read David Bland's book or go to Cameron's program or something like that. Those are all great and I recommend them. But from a tactical perspective, I'll do this by way of example. This is like half true, even though it's got real names in it. So, you know, that's my way of don't sue me. But the Masterclass, you familiar with Masterclass website? Sounds like a lot of people are. Okay. So basic idea of Masterclass now is that people who are professionals in a field record online classes for those who want to do better at that. One of their initial things was to like learn from Thomas Keller how to cook better in your own kitchen, right? So it's that. It's basically the online courses, but taught by, you know, some serious people. Like they have like Academy Award-winning screenwriters. I think Stephen King has a course on there on novel writing. Like they've got big names on there now, and they've been successful for a while. But they're a great story in terms of how they got started because they did exactly what you're talking about. So like one of the things that they recognize, and I don't know, again, we apply some regression to the curve of reality when we tell these stories. So I don't know like when and how they learned this, and we end up giving them a lot of credit. And I don't know, you know, how that actually works, but we'll go with the avatar here. They said like, okay, the technology part doesn't matter. Like a platform, e-courses, video, like who cares, right? Like that's not interesting. Most founders, their instinct is going to be, well, let me build this platform and see if I can sell it to some people. But that's not the interesting part. And so like, if you think about something similar to innovation accounting, right? It's not a metric, but it is vanity action, right? So it's what I call procrastivity. It's the things that seem really productive, but you're really just procrastinating, doing the thing that matters. So like in this example, Masterclass just getting started, they have this cockamamie scheme, building a platform isn't what matters. What is? What is what matters? That's right, Stephen, customer validation. And so what they did is they said, well, first things first, let's go talk to people who want to learn to be a better home cook. And so they just interviewed a number of people, and I don't even know how many, but they ended up with more than 1,000 people on their quote unquote wait list. And what made this waitlist interesting is they didn't just collect email addresses. They didn't put up a landing page and just like do, you know, capture some email addresses. Although there's nothing wrong with that. You know, Dropbox did that to great effect, but they got 50,000 overnight, and that's a different story, right? But instead, they had 1,000 people to give their mailing address. You're much less likely to give your home address to somebody, right? In exchange. So it signaled a little bit more interest. They didn't collect money, but it collected 1,000 people here. Then they said, all right, now let's go talk to chefs. And they knew they couldn't go to, you know, Gordon Ramsay or somebody like that, right? Because they're not going to be interested in the platform until it's already wildly successful. By the way, I think Gordon Ramsay is on the platform now. It's not going to be that. It's not going to be the people with their own TV show on Food Network. It's not going to be even the people with PBS cooking shows, but it's going to be somebody with enough name recognition that it's like, oh, I know who they are. They run successful restaurants. That's Thomas Keller's a great example. He runs the French Laundry and a bunch of other restaurants. And so then he went to talk to those chefs and said, I got 1,000 people just waiting to learn from you. Like, you know, and I want to build this, you know, this video platform. People can learn how to do that. We'll do all the equipment. We'll do the recording. We'll do the editing. All you got to do is, you know, cook some shit. And then use that not only to validate that the restaurateurs or chefs would be interested, but also to figure out what compensation would have to look like for those chefs. Right? Like, how do we make this interesting enough for them? What's like, is it a rev share? Is it, you know, whatever? Like, we don't know. So they use that part to figure it out. Then went back and double checked with the founders. I don't know exactly how that looked, but then they took these two things and said, and went and talked to investors and said, all right, I got, you know, proof from the market here that this is super interesting. I've got, you know, proof from the other side of the market that they're willing to do this, and this would be interesting for them too. To bring them together, I just need to make a platform, and that's easy. Give me money. Can I has, please? And they were able to raise a round on that. That's the work. And like, that's an example of like using it for fundraising, but it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, the hard part is finding out if there's a there. And the way to do that, then it's hard, not because of the work is necessarily hard. Like you just literally went and interviewed people. Like it's a lot of work, but it's not hard. It's hard because it's incredibly vulnerable. And entrepreneurship is the most vulnerable job that you can have, because you're taking something that's important to you and you're going to the marketplace and saying, punch me in the gut. And more often not the do. Like, I just being honest, right? Like, I just being honest. More often than not, you're gonna get punched in the gut. And like, I had a friend, I still have a friend, his name's Kirk. He uses this metaphor. He said, everybody talks about that entrepreneurship is like, you know, jumping out of an airplane the first time with your parachute. It's like skydiving for the first time. And that resonates with a lot of people, right? Like, oh, I'm, you know, jumping out of the airplane, I'm taking this big risk. And he said, that's not it at all. He said, the work of an entrepreneur isn't learning how to jump out of the airplane or get started or whatever people say. Where am I going, Laura?
She's going to jump out of a plane.
Yeah, apparently. She's like, where's skydiving near here?
And just don't do load high.
So anyway, right in my poignant moment there, Laura. So he said the hardest part, Kirk said the hardest part is not jumping out of the airplane. It's not getting started. He said the hardest part being an entrepreneur is learning to bounce when your parachute doesn't open. I think that that's too true.
I don't have it.
Yes.
We got time for maybe
Yeah.
one or two more.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a corporate venture capitalist. Been engaging with the entrepreneurs for a very long time. So I'm just wondering what's your advice for entrepreneurs to embrace failures and pivot their product market fit or entirely the company portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, you know, without sounding super cliche, I think it's flipping the like failure to like really the learning mentality, and more so from a systematic way of experimenting. And so it's like understanding when the failure is like big enough that the model just doesn't work, and maybe it's time to, you know, find another, you know, avenue to go down. Or if it's, oh, this was a mini failure of like, hey, I set the target to be, you know, 50% and I got 20%, and what was actually wrong. And so you can make a decision and then therefore learn from it. I think setting it up as like the failure, be comfortable with failing. Like it's not, your intention is not to go out to fail, it's to go out to learn, and what you learned right and what you learned wrong to then be able to go do something different. So that's kind of what I would embrace, and then building that into the culture. And we teach a lot of like from a systematic way of the like experiment cards of like testing. And obviously as you get bigger, it gets more complex in how you're ultimately doing that, but it's built into that culture of we're seeking to test this assumption. We might be right or wrong. If we're way wrong, does that mean, yeah, that could be a failure of something that's going on, but it's really with that intent to learn and do something different. So that's how I would.
I mean, I agree with all that. I think one of the things that I would add is that the goal isn't to fail, right? I think that's how it often comes across, is like the goal is to fail. And of course, that's just dumb. Like, I don't know why anybody would take that position seriously, but the goal isn't to fail. The goal is to, like, the whole startup process, whole process of innovation is built around de-risking. Like, we don't use that word. That's the corporate word, though. The corporate word is as a corporate VC, right? The word is de-risk. Like, we say we want to de-risk this venture, which means to, like, through a well-known systematic process, we're going to remove as much risk as possible. And you can use the exact same language in startups and it would apply there. It's just not part of the lingo. And so it's like, okay, well, we're going to find out what's our riskiest assumption in here. That's where the risk is, right? And so it's what's going to be have the biggest impact if we fail, for which we also have the least amount of data. Right? That's where the risk is. That's by definition, that's risk. And so we find that thing and we test that. That's not to say that we're right about it, but and like failure is learning. That's all true, but it's this tiny failure. And so the goal is to fail fast and fail cheap, but not to fail epically, right? Like, epic failure is not, like, it happens to everybody. Like, we've all had our epic fails and we'll have our too. And like, the important thing is to learn from them and not make the same mistake twice. But you know, more often than not, we're like, I agree, like, flip it and focus on, like, this is really about getting learning and understanding that the sooner we find out that something isn't true, the sooner we can move on. Whether that's moving on, you know, pack it in and move on, or whether that's just a pivot, right?
John here again.
Hi, John.
John's back.
So I hear all the time from entrepreneurs and people at like entrepreneur events, like, oh, you need to just start, like, just take that first step, whatever that first step is. But I feel like that kind of contradicts the, like, doing the groundwork ahead of time to de-risk your venture if you're actually going to act on it. So I don't know. I feel like there's just kind of like a disconnect between those two things that people are hearing. So like at what point, obviously you can take that first step, and that first step could be like doing the market research, going and actually getting customer or potential customer feedback and all of that stuff. But I know it seems to me like a lot of entrepreneurs, they just like, oh, I'm gonna go file, for a business license and all this stuff. So
Yeah.
Go for it.
I think I just first want to validate the question because I think it's really great. There's two different things, and there's a balance that's absolutely necessary between like doing and doing smartly, right? Like you don't want to like go and blindly do a bunch of stuff because then you're not de-risking it at all, right? And like if you think about using risk to guide your actions, go and creating the business license, unless you actually have a regulatory, legal, legislative, or financial risk to getting that license, like that's not where the risk is right now. And so like we're doing something that feels productive, right? It's like, oh, I got a business license. And by the way, I'll offer another controversial opinion. Same thing applies to patents most of the time too. It's like, oh, I got a patent, to this cool thing. I'm like, okay, and you can afford all the lawyers to defend that patent? I didn't think so. So like, it's just not the thing that matters right away. It's not where your biggest risk is. Your biggest risk is that you spent thousands of dollars and a couple of years of your time patenting something you can never sell. So like that's kind of how I think about it. So it's like, how do you find a balance between those two things? And while I do land on the side of being biased toward action, I think when all else being equal, always favor doing. So if you reach a point where you say, I'm not sure, the answer is to do it, because what we're feeling in that moment is probably resistance preventing us from being vulnerable. But that does mean that there is a baseline level of work. And to me, that baseline level of work is identifying where the risk is. And so if you there's David Bland, I think, calls it assumptions mapping in his book, Testing Business Ideas. There's a number of different ways of doing the same thing. But the basic idea is, if you, like I said before, create a model. If you have a model of your company, you say, and the second thing you do is separate fact from conjecture. What do I know versus what do I think I know? And the other things I think I know, to what degree, right, do I not know them, or to what degree do I know the things that I think are facts? And then how impactful is it for those to be wrong? And if you find the ones that are really impactful as I'm wrong, and the ones for which we have the least amount of data, on a scale from wild ass guess to robust evidence, then like those are the ones that where the risk is. And so like the first thing you need to do is test that. But you can't do that unless you do the groundwork to say, where is the risk? But as long as the focus is on finding the risk, I don't think it's a waste of time.
I think that another way to, I was introduced to these two terms of adaptive work, which is like going out and talking to people, and it's not like something like the other type of work, of technical work, of like, oh, I built a landing page and it feels good because it's something tangible that I created, versus I talked to 20 people. Now I have to distill, what did I learn from that going forward? And so one of the things, and like even, I recognize like in our programs, we teach people to build like a lean canvas, which is like their model of understanding. But it's like part of it is like that then helps you understand your assumptions on a piece of paper. Now, what do you have to go do to ultimately validate or invalidate that? And part of going to the market and bringing that back, the challenges is then like, say to your earlier question of coming and talking to say Josh, would be like distilling, like, this is what I've learned, not I went and talked to 20 people. Like, what did you take away from that conversation? And were you right or wrong? And either way, maybe that's where you need help distilling what that information is. And oftentimes one of the things I see is like, they'll create a lean canvas or some sort of tool, business model canvas, and then they come back 2 weeks later with new ideas on top of it, but not having actually got those ideas from customers or from the market. It was just them continuing to think about the tool itself and ideating around the tool versus getting more nuanced by what the market's actually saying. And so you need to ultimately bring that back and make a decision around it. Time, maybe one last question, and then we'll close it out.
It's like just Ethan.
All right.
When you were saying earlier, I really compel startup founders or business owners to make connections before they need them, get involved with the local community and networks and stuff like that. I relate to that a lot because, like many entrepreneurs, I feel like an immense amount of pressure to get something going very quickly, to get traction very quickly, to build something, have some kind of evidence, some kind of revenue, something really quickly. And the temptation is, you're like, oh, I should be networking, I should make a relationship with this person, but that's like soft work. That doesn't have a direct output. Why do that when I could like build my business and then get to the point where I want to be sooner? And obviously the correct answer is to do a blend of community outreach, network making, and then a blend of like direct business inputs. But how do you balance that when you just feel like a lot of pressure to get traction immediately, and you're like, oh, like I should just be talking to customers, building out my websites, doing like customer calls, testing ads or whatever, and you feel like you don't have enough time already.
I mean, I think the way I would take that is like, what are you trying to learn in that process of like talking to all these different types of people? And so if it's like, okay, I see the next risk I have is I'm trying to build something technical and I'm not a technical co-founder. It's not just attending general events, it's attending like SAC Tech or other things that are related to that industry. And so it's having intentionality for the networks and things that you're plugging into. And it's not like, I think the mindset sometimes comes across as like, oh, I'm going to just take from this thing and then I'm on to the next one. And it's about having the consistency and showing up and supporting that ecosystem. And then when you do have something is like, hey, I'm at this point where now my next major risk is that I need a technical co-founder. You have those relationships, would be kind of how I would think about it. So it's continuing to just plug into those with an intentional way, but not with like, I'm just going to take from that particular partnership. Yeah. All right. You want to close us out with start with frivolous thoughts? I need to think of mine.
So for those of you who don't know, as we reach the end of our time together here, we end each episode with a frivolous thought, usually something that doesn't have anything to do with startups, although there are exceptions to that, just to end on something light and frivolous, the frivolity, if you will. And Cameron asked me to go first because, as normal, Cameron didn't come to the table with anything, and I'm vamping because neither did I. So I will say this, actually. So I do have one. This will continue my my series of like television-based ones. So which is weird because I actually watch very little television. I have a toddler, but I did start watching what is the reboot of Matlock. And I don't know if anybody else has seen it. I've only watched the first episode, and then I was like, I think my wife will like this. So I'm waiting for her to watch it. And it's been a couple weeks, so then we'll watch it together. But here's what I think is really interesting about this TV show is that it's not a reboot of Matlock, and I'm not gonna. There's no spoiler here. Like in the first scene, she said she's named her name is Matlock, like the old TV show. Like they're not trying to like it's not like, oh, this is the daughter or like something like that they do. So like the Matlock TV show exists within world. It's just like a really weird way of doing that. And all the B characters in the show they're fine, but they're like any legal drama. But what I actually found like phenomenally fun is that Kathy Bates is playing Matlock, Lady Matlock, and she is just so exceptionally compelling to watch in that role, and it's easy to forget how phenomenal an actress that she is. I mean, her career spans so long. But I found myself not caring much at all about anybody else in the show and only getting through this first episode by saying like how fun she was to watch. And it's very rare to get that from a TV show. And like, can that hold a show in the long term? Probably not. But maybe the season does get better. But like, if you just want to watch like Kathy Bates do fine work, watch Matlock. She's crazy fun.
Nice. Well, thanks for giving me time. And I didn't come up with anything super creative. And I don't know if this was on our one of our earlier ones, but one of our neighbors over the weekend put up their Christmas tree and all the things, and with Thanksgiving, and so it's just interesting how quickly like those holidays are coming before other ones. Like Katie, my wife, she just went into like Green Acres, and they had like all this stuff, and it's like they're selling like way beforehand these days. And so it's like just surprising how quickly those holidays are coming. And so that's been throwing us off, is like, hey, we still are keeping our pumpkins out and doing all of that stuff. So that was my
well, speaking of like controversial frivolity here, like what is the date on the calendar where stores can start putting up Christmas things and that homes can start being decorated for Christmas?
I think like the Black Friday, right after Thanksgiving.
Right after Thanksgiving. I agree with you on that, but I think we lost this battle.
We have.
We lost
well, consumerism has got us.
Yes. Okay. What about you guys? What's the date?
They know.
November 24th.
We have our Grinch in the Laura Good the Grinch. Well, we appreciate you joining us for our live session of Zero to Traction, and appreciate the questions and engagement. Just in kind of, I'll do a Global Entrepreneurship Week close and then you close us out. But next for the week, we have the NorCal AngelCon pitch event taking place this evening. So this is a culminating event of an angel investor training that started in April and May. And then they're going to be making a selection into one company for a $100,000 investment. And we're really excited to see who they choose. We'll also have a few student teams pitching there for some cash awards as well. So join us up at the Growth Factory up in Rockland this evening. And then tomorrow we're back at it with a few events here in the Carlson Center. So we hope to see you, and thanks for being here. So to you to close us out.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here in person, watching on YouTube, or listening in the podcast feed. Really appreciate it there. For those of you who are here in person and want to, you can always find the show on any of your podcast feeds, but you can also go to Zero to Traction. I think it's zerotraction.show, but zerotraction.substack.com, and you can put in your email address there. It's free. There's nothing paid there, and so you can get the emails with the show notes and and all that every week when we do an episode. And speaking of which, for all the rest of you, for the subscribers out there, I have to say it. I'm required by podcasting law to say it. Please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this. Podcasts spread almost entirely by word of mouth, believe it or not. And so, tell a friend if you thought it was interesting and valuable. And if you didn't, still leave a review, because believe it or not, it still works. So feel free to trash us on iTunes, and that'll be fine as well. We just appreciate the review and helping us get the word out. And with that, we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Thank you all.
This is the awkward part where we gotta go turn off the live stream because we don't have a producer in the room. Should probably turn this off before I say something I'm gonna regret.